So welcome to Revolution Books. If you've never been here before, this is a place where people come from all over the world to find the books and the engagement with each other about why the world is the way it is, why it is the horror it is for the great majority of humanity, why the planet is in peril. And also it's a place where they can find the solution to that, how we can actually bring about a better world. This is a place that's scientific and visionary. It's a place where we debate and wrangle and argue, and at the same time, we have a poetic spirit of the imagination, and we're infused with the understanding of what the world actually could be. So I want to thank you for coming tonight and for supporting the store by coming. So much appreciation for that. And I especially want to thank Colson Whitehead for coming. I'm looking where. Colson Whitehead. By the way, this is a new stage, so I'm like not so used to being almost up to the ceiling. But I want to thank Colson for coming, and especially I want to thank him for this book, The Underground Railroad. It really is a gift to all of us. It's an experience. It's a read like few others. It's just such a passage that it takes you through. It's a passage of imagination. It's storytelling. And we go through the foundational roots of America, which, as he writes in this book, he says you have to look outside the window as you speed through and you'll find the true face of America. So just thank you for the book and thank you for coming to Revolution Books. Because of the tight schedule, for those of you who are regulars at Revolution Books, I am not going to give a fundraising pitch after Colson speaks. I'm going to do it right now. But not only that, I'm not going to do much of a fundraising pitch because there's something very important we need to very briefly talk about and I need to tell you about. Colson agreed to come tonight in part because we are 5 days after the election of Donald Trump. We called for 65 defiant days at Revolution Books to oppose this regime, to give you a forum to be able to get into why this has developed, the roots of this fascism, the roots of this misogyny, the roots of this election, what it is we can do about it. There have been cultural programs. Arturo Farrell was here. He did just a wonderful concert that was full of defiance. He played a song called Fuck Trump Fuck. It was very inspiring and it fired up the audience. And tonight's program is part of that, even as what we're going to focus on is this book. And when we approached Colson, we were inspired also by his speech, acceptance speech of the National Book Award, where he said, be kind, make art, fight the power. And if you can't remember that, then he gave a mnemonic, BMF, don't let him get you, be a bad motherfucker. If that's more or less correct. Okay, look, what I wanted to tell you about briefly is that in addition to this 65 days, I have been part of, along with Carl Dix, who's here, and Sarah Taylor and Cornell West, and about 5 other people, initiating a new movement called RefuseFascism.org. This is calling for a month of resistance, beginning on Monday, the day of the Electoral College, here in New York. There will be a town meeting, a emergency organizing meeting that's called Prevent the Trump-Pence Regime from Taking Power. Stop it before it starts at Cooper Union, the Great Hall there. It will, at this point, this is just days old. Jeremy Scahill will be speaking. Carl Dix will be speaking. The scientist and blogger P.Z. Myers will be speaking. Immortal Technique will be speaking. And the actor David Strathern will be speaking via video. And there are others. That list is all in formation. But the point of all this is this. We have to stop this. The time to stop it is now, before the inauguration, to create the kind of mass resistance where this regime is not able to cohere. We have to create the situation where millions and tens of millions of people are in the streets in January, where they get in the streets by MLK weekend and they stay in the streets until this regime is driven out of power. There's plenty of reasons for it to be gone, most especially that it is illegitimate. Now, I don't want to take the time up right now from Colson being here to go into this further. You heard me. I'll be here afterwards. We can talk about it. Carl, raise your hand. Carl Dix is here. And he and Cornell West initiated the movement to stop mass incarceration, and they are part of the founding group of this. So this is what I want to tell you about. I want to leave you with that foremost in your mind. At the same time, I want to say, please support Revolution Books. It's very important. It's more important now than ever. There's no other place like this where you can actually find a scientific method to analyze why the world is the way it is, where there's a poetic spirit, and where there is actually an understanding of how we could actually make a revolution in a country like this and what that would be through the work of Bob Avakian. Again, after the program, you can talk to me about that. But do not take this store for granted. It will not be here without your support. And we're not going to let you not support the store. Okay. Now, let's go to the book. I said a few things about it. I just want to say just a couple more things just to get you ready for this book. Like all great art, it's tremendously inventive. It's a skewing of reality, but in this skewing is a far greater truth. It's just we have here the slave narratives of Simon Northrop. We have Toni Morrison's Beloved, which, as I mentioned to Colson, changed my life when I read it first. We have Gabriel Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. I guess you said you kind of dialed that down from 10 on the magical realism, but I have to say what this book takes you through is extraordinary, but in so doing it delivers a greater truth. And he says, there's a quote in the book that it's appropriate to read at Revolution Books anyway. It says, "And America too is a delusion, the greatest one of all. The white race believes with all its heart that it is their right to take the lead to kill Indians, make war, enslave their brothers. This nation shouldn't exist if there is any justice in the world, for its foundations are murder, theft, and cruelty. Yes, here we are." And I have to say that, yes, here we are, has been driven home in an incredible way in the last 4 weeks. So this book is filled with fury, the resilience of a people, the determination to break free in the face of just what seemed to be impossible odds. It's just, there's so much love and passion in the face of just the most unbelievable terror that it just takes you on a journey you don't want to miss. And also, I have to say that you really feel the sense of possibility, the sense of hope when everything seems all but hopeless. And I want to say that Cora's, who's the main character in the book, her hope is a hope born of daring. And we need much more daring today. The daring that's exhibited in this novel and the daring of all of you to act to change the world. So I want to, with that, have you join me in welcoming Colson Whitehead to Revolution Books.
Hey, howdy. Thanks for the bookstore for having me, and all you nice folks for coming out. I guess my tour was officially over, and then I got an email from the store, and I was like, I've got to represent for Revolution Books. That's where I bought Wretched of the Earth, 30 years ago. So, very important. New York institution. The book is called The Underground Railroad. I was sitting on my couch about 16 years ago and came across a reference to the railroad and thought back to when I first heard about it in 4th grade, and my teacher was telling us about it, and I immediately envisioned a literal network of tracks beneath the earth for about 2 minutes before she told me how it actually worked. But I just thought, that'd be a weird premise for a book, and so I quickly added the sort of complicating structure of that each state, our hero, at that point, the protagonist was a man, goes through as he runs north. South Carolina, North Carolina is a different state of American possibility, sort of like Gulliver's Travels, where each time he goes to a different state, the book sort of reboots, and we get a different kind of take on what could have been or where America's going. But before Cora, our protagonist, sets off, we start in Georgia, and she's on a plantation there. She's a stray in the language of the plantation. Her parents are gone, and she's raising herself. In this section, there's a reference to Caesar. Caesar is a new addition to the plantation. He was raised on a plantation in Virginia and promised that once his owner died, he'd be set free. She dies, but he's not set free. He's sold down south along with his parents, whom he never sees again. And And being sold down south, of course, the system gets more and more brutal the more you go down. And so he's being acquainted with a different type of slavery. They're on the Randall plantation, owned by two brothers, James and Terrence. The occasion for this first section is the birthday of old Jockey, who's the oldest slave in the plantation. Whenever he senses a need for release in the slave quarters, he declares, "It's my birthday," and they have a feast, and they have music, and it's a brief celebration in the midst of the plantation hell. And then finally there's a reference to Chester, who's also sort of orphan like Cora, and he's 10 years old, and Cora has taken him under her wing. The music stopped, the circle broke. Sometimes a slave will be lost in a brief eddy of liberation, in the sway of a sudden reverie among the furrows, or while untangling the mysteries of an early morning dream, in the middle of a song on a warm Sunday night. Then it comes always, the overseer's cry, the call to work, the shadow of the master, the reminder that she's only a human being for a tiny moment across the eternity of her servitude. The Randall brothers had emerged from the great house and were among them. The slave stepped aside, making calculations of what distance represented the right proportion of fear and respect. Godfrey, James's houseboy, held up a lantern. According to old Abraham, James favored the mother, stout as a barrel and just as firm in countenance, and Terrence took after the father, tall and owl-faced, perpetually on the verge of swooping down on prey. In addition to the land, they inherited their father's tailor, who arrived once a month in his rickety carriage with his samples of linen and cotton. The brothers dressed alike when they were children and continued to do so into manhood. Their white trousers and shirts were as clean as the laundry girl's hands could make them, and the orange glow made the men look like ghosts emerging from the dark. "Master James," Jockey said. His good hand gripped the arm of his chair as if to rise. "Master Terrence." "Don't let us disturb you," Terrence said. "My brother and I were discussing business and heard the music." I told him, "Now that is the most god-awful racket I've ever heard." The Randalls were drinking wine out of goblets of cut glass and looked as if they drained a few bottles. Cora searched for Caesar's face in the crowd. She didn't find him. He hadn't been present the last time the brothers appeared together on the northern half. You did well to remember the different lessons of those occasions. Something always happened when the Randalls ventured into the slave quarter, sooner or later. A new thing coming that you couldn't predict until it was upon you. James left the daily operations to his man Connolly and rarely visited. He might grant a tour to a visitor, a distinguished neighbor or curious planter from another neck of the woods, but it was rare. James rarely addressed his niggers, who'd been taught by the lash to keep working and ignore his presence. When Terrence appeared in his brother's half of the plantation, he usually appraised each slave, made a note of which men were the most able and which women the most appealing. Content to leer at his brother's women, he grazed heartily upon the women of his own half. "I like to taste my plums," Terrence said, prowling the rows of cabins to see what struck his fancy. He violated the bonds of affection, sometimes visiting slaves on their wedding night to show the husband the proper way to discharge his marital duty. He tasted his plums and broke the skin and left his mark. It was accepted that James was of a different orientation. To hear his valet, Prideful, tell it, James confined his erotic energies to specialized rooms in a New Orleans establishment. The madam was broad-minded and modern, adept in the trajectories of human desire. Prideful's stories were hard to believe, despite assurances that he received his reports from the staff of the place with whom he'd grown close over the years. After all, what kind of white man would willingly submit to the whip? Terrence scratched his cane in the dirt. It had been his father's cane, topped by a silver wolf's head. Many remembered its bite on their flesh. Terrence said, "Then I recollected James telling me about a nigger you had down here, could recite the Declaration of Independence. I can't bring myself to believe him. I thought perhaps tonight he can show me, since everyone is out and about from the sound of it." "We'll settle it," James said. "Where is that boy? Michael?" No one said anything. Godfrey waved the lantern around pathetically. Moses was the boss, unfortunate enough to stand closest to the Randall brothers. He cleared his throat. "Michael dead, Master James." Michael, the slave in question, had indeed possessed the ability to recite long passages. According to Connolly, who heard the story from the nigger trader, Michael's former master was fascinated by the abilities of South American parrots and reasoned that if a bird could be taught limericks, a slave might be taught to remember as well. Merely glancing at the size of their skulls told you that a nigger possessed a bigger brain than a bird. Michael had been the son of his master's coachman, had a brand of animal cleverness, the kind you see in pigs sometimes. The master and his unlikely pupil starred with simple rhymes and short passages from popular British versifiers. They went slow over the words the nigger didn't understand, and if truth be told, the master only half understood. But they made miracles, the tobacco farmer and the coachman's son. The Declaration of Independence was their masterpiece. Michael's ability never accounted to more than a parlor trick, delighting visitors before the discussion turned, as it always did, to the diminished faculties of niggers. His owner grew bored and sold the boy south. By the time Michael got to Randall, some torture or punishment had addled his senses. He was a mediocre worker. He complained of noises and black spells that blotted his memory. In exasperation, Connolly beat out what little brains he had left. It was a scourging that Michael was not intended to survive, and it achieved its purpose. James said, "I should have been told," his displeasure plain. Michael's recitation had been a novel diversion the 2 times he trotted the nigger out for guests. Terence liked to tease his brother. "James," he said, "you need to keep better account of your property." "Oh, don't meddle," Terence continued. "I knew you let your slave have rebels, but I had no idea they were so extravagant." "Are you trying to make me look bad?" James's glass was empty. He turned to go. "Don't pretend you care what a nigger thinks about you, Terence." "Oh, one more song, James. These sounds have grown on me." George and Wesley, the musicians, were forlorn. Noble and his tambourine were nowhere to be seen. James pressed his lips into a slit. He gestured, and the men started playing. Terence tapped his cane. His face sank as he took in the crowd. "You're not going to dance? I have to insist. You and you and you." They didn't wait for their master's signal. The slaves of the northern half converged on the alley haltingly, trying to insinuate themselves into the previous rhythm and put on a show. Putting on a show for master was a familiar skill, the small angles and advantages of the mask, and they shook off their fear as they settled into the performance. Oh, how they capered and hollered, shouted and hopped. Certainly this was the most lively song they'd ever heard, the musicians the most accomplished players the colored race had to offer. Cora dragged herself into the circle, checking the Randall brothers' reactions on every turn like everyone else. Jockey tumbled his hands into his lap to keep time. Cora found Caesar's face. He stood in the shadow of the kitchen, his expression flat. Then he withdrew. "You!" It was Terence. He held his hand before him as if it were covered in some eternal stain that only he could see. Then Cora caught sight of it, the single drop of wine staining the cuff of his lovely white shirt. Chester, the boy, had bumped him. Chester simpered and bowed before the white man. Sorry, master. The cane crashed across his shoulder and head again and again. The boy screamed and shrank to the dirt as the blows continued. Terence's arm rose and fell. James looked tired. One drop. A feeling settled over Cora. She'd not been under its spell in years since she brought the hatchet down on Blake's doghouse and sent the splinters into the air. She'd seen men hung from trees and left for buzzards and crows, women carved open to the bones with the cat o' nine tails, feet cut off to prevent escape, and hands cut off to stop theft. She'd seen boys and girls younger than this beaten and had done nothing. This night the feeling settled over her heart again. It grabbed hold of her, and before the slave part of her caught up with the human part of her, She was bent over the boy's body as a shield. She held the cane in her hand like a swamp man handling a snake and saw the ornament at its tip. The silver wolf bared its silver teeth. Then the cane was out of her hand. It came down on her head. It crashed down again, and this time the silver teeth ripped across her eyes and her blood splattered the dirt. So, after that, conditions deteriorate for Cora on the plantation, and she does decide to run away with Caesar on the railroad. And I guess in the book there's the main thread of Cora's story, and then there's sort of biographical chapters, usually about 6 pages. But Ridgway, the slave catcher who's pursuing Cora, sort of demanded 10, so I gave him 10. So this is him. Arnold Ridgway's father was a blacksmith. The sunset glow of molten iron bewitched him, the way the color emerged in the stock slow and then fast, overtaking it like an emotion, the sudden pliability and restless writhing of the thing as it waited for purpose. His forge was a window into the primitive energies of the world. He had a saloon partner named Tom Bird, a half-breed who took a sentimental turn when lubricated by whiskey. On nights when Tom Bird felt separate from his life's design, he shared stories of the Great Spirit. The Great Spirit lived in all things, the earth, the sky, the animals, and forests, flowing through and connecting them in a divine thread. Although Ridgway's father scorned religious talk, Tom Bird's testimony on the Great Spirit reminded him of how he felt about iron. He bent to no god save the glowing iron he tended in his forge. He'd read about the great volcanoes, the lost city of Pompeii destroyed by fire that poured out of mountains from deep below. Liquid fire was the very blood of the earth. It was his mission to upset, mash, and draw out the metal into the useful things that made society operate. Nails, horseshoes, plows, knives, guns, chains. Work in the spirit, he called it. When permitted, young Ridgway stood in the corner while his father worked Pennsylvania iron, melting, hammering, dancing around his anvil. Sweat dripping down his face, covered in soot, foot to crown, blacker than an African devil. You gotta work that spirit, boy. One day he would find his spirit, his father told him. He was 14 when he took up with the slave patrollers. Slave patrol was not difficult work. They stopped any niggers they saw and demanded their passes. They stopped niggers they knew to be free for their amusement, but also to remind the Africans of the forces arrayed against them, whether they were owned by a white man or not. They made the rounds of the slave villages in search of anything amiss, a smile or a book. They flogged the wayward niggers before bringing them to the jail or directly to their owner if they were in the mood and it was not too close to quitting time. News of a runaway sent them into cheerful activity. They raided the plantations after their quarry, interrogating a host of quivering darkies. Free men knew what was coming and hid their valuables and moaned when the white men smashed their furniture and glass, praying they confined their damage to objects. There were perquisites, apart from the thrill of shaming a man in front of his family or roughing up an unseasoned buck who squinted at you the wrong way. The old Mutter farm had the comeliest colored wenches Mr. Mutter had a taste, and the excitement of the hunt put a slave patroller in a lusty mood. According to some, the backwoods stills of the old men on the stone plantation produced the best corn whiskey in the county, and a roust allowed Ridgway to replenish his jars. Ridgway commanded his appetites in those days, withdrawing before his Confederates' more egregious displays. The other patrollers were boys and men of bad character. The work attracted a type. In another country, they would have been criminals, but this was America. He liked the night work best, when they lay in wait for a buck who sneaked through the woods to visit his wife on a plantation up the road, or a squirrel hunter looking to supplement his daily meal of slop. Other patrollers carried guns and eagerly cut down any rascal dumb enough to flee, but not Ridgway. Nature had equipped him with weapons enough. Ridgway ran them down as if they were rabbits, and then his fists subdued them. Beat them for being out, beat them for running, even though the chase was the only remedy for his restlessness. Charging through the dark, branches lashing his face, stumps sending him ass over elbow before he got up again. In the chase, his blood sang and glowed. And then he moves from slave patroller to slave catcher in a few years. New York was the start of a wild time. Ridgway worked retrieval, heading north when constables sent word they'd captured a runaway from Virginia or North Carolina. New York became a frequent destination, and after exploring different aspects of his character, Ridgway picked up stakes. The fugitive trade back home was straightforward, knocking heads. Up north, the gargantuan metropolis, the liberty movement, and the ingenuity of the colored community all converged to portray the true scale of the hunt. He was a quick study. It was more like remembering than learning. Sympathizers and mercenary captains smuggled fugitives into the city ports. Interns, stevedores, and dockhands and clerks furnished him with information, and he scooped up the rascals on the threshold of deliverance. Free men informed on their African brothers and sisters, comparing the descriptions of runaways in the gazettes with the furtive creatures slinking around the colored churches, saloons, and meeting houses. He fell in with a circle of slave catchers, gorillas stuffed into black suits with ridiculous derbies. He had to prove he was not a bumpkin, but just once. Together they shadowed runaways for days, hiding outside the places of work until opportunity announced itself, breaking into their Negro hovels at night to kidnap them. After years away from the plantation, after taking a wife, starting a family, they had convinced themselves that they were free, as if owners forgot about property. The delusions made them easy prey. He snubbed the blackbirders, the 5 Points gang who hog-tied freemen and dragged them south for auction. That was low behavior, patroller behavior. He was a slave catcher now. While Ridgway waited at the docks for smugglers, the magnificent ships from Europe dropped anchor and discharged passengers. Everything they owned in sacks, half-starving, hapless as niggers by any measure. But they'd be called to their proper places as he had been. His whole world growing up in the South was a ripple of this first immigrant arrival. This dirty white flood with nowhere to go but out. South, west. The same laws governed garbage and people. The gutters of the city overflowed with refuse, but the mess found its place in time. He watched them stagger down the gangplanks, roomy and bewildered, overcome by the city. The possibilities laid before these pilgrims like a banquet, and they'd been so hungry their whole lives. They'd never seen the likes of this, but they'd leave their mark on this new land as surely as those famous souls at Jamestown, making it theirs through unstoppable racial logic. If niggers were supposed to have their freedom, they wouldn't be in chains. If the red man was supposed to keep hold of his land, it'd still be his. If the white man wasn't destined to take this new world, he wouldn't own it now. Here was the true Great Spirit, the divine thread connecting all human endeavor. If you can keep it, it's yours. Your property, slave, or continent. The American imperative. Ridgway gathered renown with his facility for ensuring that property remained property. When a runaway took off down an alley, he knew where the man was headed, the direction and aim. His trick? Don't speculate on where the slave is headed next. Concentrate instead on the idea that he's running away from you. Not from a cruel master or the vast agency of bondage, but you specifically. It worked again and again, his own iron fact, in alleys and pine barrens and swamps. He finally left his father behind and the burden of that man's philosophy. Ridgway was not working the spirit. He was not the smith rendering order, not the hammer, not the anvil. He was the heat. And then finally, that used to be my reading, and then after the election, I started reading this last part. because this seemed to make sense to me. So one of the places that Core gets to is a sort of utopian farm in Indiana that's owned by a black farmer named Valentine, and free men and fugitive slaves are gathering there, making a sort of separate community. And they have, every Saturday, they get together and talk about the issues of the day and talk about what's next for the black race, sort of echoing various, the sort of late 19th century arguments of Booker T. Washington and Du Bois and Frederick Douglass. So on this night, Mingo, who's sort of a conservative, has given his talk, and then Lander, another gentleman, is about to speak. Brother Mingo made some good points, Lander said. We can't save everyone, but that doesn't mean we can't try. Sometimes a useful delusion is better than a useless truth. Nothing's going to grow in this mean cold, but we can still have flowers. Here's one delusion, that we can escape slavery. We can't. Its scars will never fade. When you saw your mother sold off, your father beaten, your sister abused by some boss or master, did you ever think that you'd sit here today without chains, without the yoke, among a new family? Everything you ever knew told you that freedom was a trick, yet here you are. Still we run, tracking by the good full moon to sanctuary. Valentine Farm is a delusion. Who told you the Negro deserved a place of refuge? Who told you that you had that right? Every minute of your life's suffering has argued otherwise. By every fact of history, it can't exist. This place must be a delusion too. Yet here we are. And America too is a delusion, the grandest one of all. The white race believes with all its heart, that it's their right to take the land, to kill Indians, make war, enslave their brothers. This nation shouldn't exist if there's any justice in the world, for its foundations are murder, theft, and cruelty. Yet here we are. I'm supposed to answer Brother Mingo's call for gradual progress, for closing our doors to those in need. I'm supposed to answer those who think this place is too close to the grievous influence of slavery and that we should move west. I don't have an answer for you. I don't know what we should do. The word we. In some ways, the only thing we have in common is the color of our skin. Our ancestors came from all over the African continent. It's quite large. Brother Valentine has maps of the world in his splendid library. You can look for yourself. They had different ways of subsistence, different customs, spoke 100 different languages. And that great mixture was brought to America in the holds of slave ships, to the north, to the south. Their sons and daughters picked tobacco, cultivated cotton, worked on the largest estates and the smallest farms. We are craftsmen and midwives and preachers and peddlers. Black hands built the White House, the seat of our nation's government. The word we. We're not one people, but many different people. How can one person speak for this great, beautiful race, which is not one race, but many, with a million desires and hopes and wishes for ourselves and our children? For we are Africans in America, something new in the history of the world, without models for what we will become. Color must suffice. It's brought us here tonight, this discussion, and will take us into the future. All I truly know is that we rise and fall as one colored family living next door to one white family. We may not know our way through the forest, but we can pick each other up when we fall, and we will arrive together. When the former residents of the Valentine Farm recalled that moment, when they told strangers and grandchildren of how they used to live and how it came to an end, their voices still trembled years later. In Philadelphia and San Francisco, in the cow towns and ranches where they eventually made a home, they mourned those who died that day. The air in the room turned prickly, they told their families, quickened by an unseen power. Whether they'd been born free or in chains, they inhabited that moment as one, the moment when you aim for the North Star and decide to run. Perhaps they're on the verge of some new order, on the verge of collapsing reason to disorder, of putting all the lessons of their history, to bear on the future? Or perhaps time, as it will, lent the occasion a gravity that it did not possess, and everything was as Lander insisted. They were deluded. But that didn't mean it wasn't true. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to just ask one question, then we're going to open up to you. We have a microphone that can go around when we do that. Well, I'm really glad you read that last passage. And now I feel like, well, maybe I shouldn't have read that quote. But I, in thinking about this program, I couldn't not ask that. But let me step back to, if you will, you began your talk by talking about something, you used the analogy to Gulliver's Travel. And that's really what happens in this book. You go from state to state, and there's just things that are, on the one hand, utterly absurd, and then they're completely real, from the tall buildings of South Carolina to North Carolina. I just wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, and maybe even, or just take one example, and just so people know that eugenics. There's the False History Museum, which maybe that's also appropriate for this time. There's I think I have the quote someplace, but it's truth is like a display window and it keeps changing. If you, maybe you could speak a bit about that. It's so much of what we're up against right now.
No, yeah, I mean, so there's a strong, fantastic element in the book, but before I get there, I wanted the first state of Georgia to be realistic and true to life. I think just because I'm going through research and thinking of my family who disappeared in the void of slavery. Did they live and die in Georgia or Florida? I have no idea. Before I started playing around with things, I wanted to be truth to sort of testify for them and everyone else who, in my own little way, who went through the experience. And then she runs away, and each state has its own scheme. And so I guess my motto was that I wouldn't stick to the facts, but I would stick to the truth. And by moving things around, it allowed me to get into a larger American truth, as opposed to just a story of one person taking the Underground Railroad. So I guess picking up this one example, North Carolina is a white supremacist state, and Cora, the main character, was partially inspired by Harriet Jacobs, who wrote a famous slave narrative. And she spent, according to her story, 7 years hiding in an attic in North Carolina before she could get passage north. So you think, hiding in an attic, Anne Frank, how can I talk about the oppression of black people in 1850 and bring in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s? The white supremacists in 1850 and white supremacists in Nazi Germany, they're all reading the same assholes from the early part of the 19th century. So all their ideas of eugenics, master race, genocidal urges, it's all the same. So how can I, by not sticking to the facts, I get to a larger truth about the oppression of black people and the oppression of Jews, and then any other who's demonized. Cora has to hide in an attic because it's illegal to be on the streets if you're black, and you'll be lynched and strung up. There are very strict race laws, and I borrow them, partially from a state like Oregon, which was founded as a white separatist state. People who are fleeing, whether they're pro or con slavery, they're just like, I just want to get the hell out and go west and start fresh. And black people were not allowed to live, work, or own property in Oregon until 1920s. And so how can I mix and match different parts of American history, world history, in order to make this a larger story than just 6 months running north?
Okay. No, it's amazing. The quote was, I did that, time was a changing display in the shop window, manipulated by hands when you weren't looking, alluring and ever out of reach.
Well, I think, Cora starts as a slave, an object, and has no agency. And so from state to state, I'm trying to find new tableaus or arenas where she could become a person, a human being, and not the sort of slave object she's been raised to be. And so when she gets to South Carolina, they have a different sort of scheme than North Carolina, but she gets a job for the first time and starts buying things. And so her relationship to money, not having it, and coveting things and shop windows becomes a way for me to articulate her sort of awakening as a person. The Living History Museum is another place that she interacts with. The museum's dioramas of an African village and the Middle Passage and a very genteel plantation. They allow her to become a critic. As she critiques the museum's displays, she's becoming more of an agent and more of a person aware of who she is, what she wants to be, and challenge different notions of freedom as she goes from state to state.
Okay, I'm going to open it up. When I read that section, I was thinking the New York Times occasionally runs this story in the travel section of 36 hours. What you can do in 36 hours if you can manage to get yourself to Hong Kong or something. But this one happened to be about touring the plantations and the tours. And when I was reading about these dioramas, I said, this is still with us, even as that was fantastic. But let's get your questions. So right up front here.
I didn't plan to be the first one. I didn't fully articulate the question in my mind, but hearing Colson talk about the need to not just give another narrative of someone moving up north in 5 months, it made me think about the idea of skewing reality to bring forth a bigger truth. And I'm wondering if you thought it was necessary to make your narrative not be the same as every narrative. Like, you know, people are arguing that we hear a lot of there's sort of a bombardment. I don't want to say it is, but some people argue that it's a bombardment of sort of like victimization narratives. You know, we've seen the movies 12 Years a Slave, the Nat Turner movie that came out recently, and a lot of the videos that are showing black people getting murdered by cops. It's sort of a overstimulation or sort of oversaturation of that image of black people just being victims. And I think the idea that you're putting forward of the same image, but sort of watching a sort of fantasy, allows people to see it in a new direction. I wanted to know if you came to that realization early on in this creation.
Sure. I mean, you know, I didn't set out to write a historical novel. I think realism has its strengths and weaknesses, and fantasy has its strengths and weaknesses. And I think you just picked the right tool for the job. And so, if you want to write a straightforward narrative about a slave's escape in 1850, go ahead. It's not what I want to do. You know, I want to sort of bring in weird characters like Ridgway, who become articulators of this American imperialistic idea in different ways. I wanted a bigger canvas. But if you want to write a historical novel, you know, go ahead. Hilary Mantel, she's great. But it's not, you know, my sort of thing. And so I think just early on I decided that I would have, you know, have the book reboot every 60 pages and it allowed me to have different alternative Americas. And the stuff I do in the book wouldn't work in a realistic framework. So I'm not sure about oversaturation. People say we have too many slave stories. I guess we're not reading the same things or whatever. But if you want to take a break from slave stories, you know, 5 years, hopefully, if the world's not blown up from Trump, you can come to this book 5 years from now and pick it up, or buy it now and then read it 5 years from now. So I get the sales before the world blows up. Howdy.
It's extremely moving, and I can understand why it would be hard to get through the book. Even writing it, I don't know how, I mean, I guess you've done a lot of research and thought about it a lot. I'm wondering about your next novel that takes place way in the future, and we're on different planets, and incorporating, you had mentioned eugenics. A lot of people don't realize, but the whole eugenics and the whole thing about molding the human race started in America with the American...
Yeah, I mean, that's in the book. I mean, he was talking about the Underground Railroad. So there's a bit about eugenics and shaping human evolution in the book, in this book.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention Eternal Treblinka, Our Treatment of Animals in the Holocaust, that it started with the American Breeders Association and the geneticists combining, and 37 states actually legalized sterilizing women, men who were either so-called criminals or so-called retarded people. And
Yeah, America's been at the forefront of various genocidal techniques and tools for generations now. It's sort of like our sideline that we have, I think.
Right here.
Mentioning that, I'm trolling along in the book in North Carolina, and then all of a sudden you slap us with the whole sterilization. Where did that come from?
It's really just, I read Bad Blood in college, and it's one of those things that sort of stuck with me, and I had wanted to incorporate it. And then I think the structure, I made a choice to have the structure really early on, and it allowed me to go these different places. And so I can bring in these different ways of America's treatment of black people, authorities' attitude towards the black body in these different scenarios. And so South Carolina becomes a way of talking about a certain kind of African American experience, and then North Carolina. And so really the structure just allowed me to is limber enough to allow core to go to these different places and the reader to come along for the ride. Well, I think not all my books are suspenseful, or I definitely have books that don't have a strong plot element. But if you're a fugitive slave running north, the life and death stakes are sort of baked in there. And so I was thinking of the conventions of suspense and subverting readers' expectations. I was sort of in there from the early part.
Hi, thank you very much. Besides this one, can you suggest 3 more books for someone who liked this book to read?
Let's talk about books that inspired me over the years. So originally when I had the idea, as in Gulliver's Travels, each state would take place in a different sort of, a much more fantastic realm. And so South Carolina, for many years when I had the story in the back of my head, it was going to take place in the future, and black people are being bred for different kinds of slave work, like factory work and domestic work, and it was, sort of Cloud Atlas-y in that kind of jump to a different time period. And then I reread the first book I'll name, 100 Years of Solitude, Garcia Marquez, and from reading this is about 2 years ago, right before I started writing. I figured instead of not having these really sort of grand, fantastic gestures, if I kept the fantasy level on like 1 instead of a Spinal Tapping 11, it would serve the story. And so everything takes place in terms of technology and slang in 1850, and I think that was a good choice for making all the sort of absurd things happen, matter of fact. So that's one book. There are a stack of novels that dealt with slavery. I was going to reread. Beloved was one. I read it 30 years ago. I was like, I'll see how Toni Morrison did it. And I got 30 pages in, and I was like, fuck, she's like the fucking master. I'm totally screwed. So I didn't reread it again. But Beloved. And then The Known World, Edward P. Jones. I was going to reread that too, but after my Morrison experience, I was like, I'm just not going to read any fiction about slavery. So those 3 books.
Okay, we haven't. Is there anybody in the back of the room? Okay, we'll take. No, you go. No, go ahead.
I guess I probably read everything you've done, but what really struck me was the thought that you actually created a railroad. Is that based on the fact that as a kid you thought about there was actually a railroad?
Yeah, just the kind of whimsical notion, and then, by making it literal, it allowed me to. It sends the book in a fantastic direction. It allows me to have these different sort of places that she goes to. So, really, when I was on my couch, it's like probably depressed on the couch. When I first came up with the idea 16 years ago, I thought, oh, would that be a weird idea? But then it was a sort of those early decisions just allowed me to have make the book work the way it does. And there's a yeah.
Impact.
With the hat, and then
How you doing? I'm really glad you're here at Revolution Books. Following up on his question about your inspiration, asking for other books, and mentioning Beloved, I was curious, it was just piqued even further. In the acknowledgement, you thanked the Misfits for the first 100 pages. You also said something, around Prince and David Bowie. And I'm curious that, the wellspring of inspiration for your work, obviously the number one thing would be slavery, the most defining aspect of this country and this land. But I was curious if you could speak a little bit more. Your acknowledgments were at the end, and I hadn't noticed that before.
Sure, I mean...
And why only the first 100? I was just curious. No one authors are referencing the Misfits.
Just as a person, and then someone who writes, I take a lot of inspiration from books and TV and music and people I know, and so they're all in my different books. And I think growing up in New York, it's loud. Like I've always done my homework with like noise outside. There's always like a car alarm going off, a siren, or someone being choked to death outside. Their screams are bugging you. So I've always played loud music when I work, and it's hip hop and electronica and Frank Sinatra, and I just have a loop of 2,000 songs. And so just with this book, personal journey. Never liked the Misfits in the '80s. I thought they were kind of too metally. And then 2 years ago, I had a reawakening with the genius of Glenn Danzig. And so first 100 pages, I was just playing a lot of sort of hardcore, a lot of early '70s stuff. And then David Bowie died, and I was like, I never got to thank David Bowie, so I was putting him in acknowledgments. And I was like, I'll thank Prince and Sonic Youth. And then Prince died a month later. I was like, but I just want to say thank all the various scholars and novelists who inspired the book, and also the musician, because they are a really important part of my process, and also just how I go through life.
Right here. Yeah.
Hi. I believe you mentioned earlier, before we started the session, regarding your influence, Frantz Fanon. Maybe I'm mistaken, but maybe could you speak about that a little bit?
Oh, I mean,
it's been
a long time since I thought about him in a serious way, but I think a lot of just weird countercultural and anti-capitalist stuff I read as a teenager, but then also just in movies and comedians, and all stuff I consumed in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up was really informed by people in the counterculture taking control of pop culture production, whether it's in movies or TV or whatever. And so I think I just soaked it up early. And so reading the book, I guess I am surprised, sometimes of the socialist critique that's in there, but it's also just part of, if you're talking about slavery and work and labor, that's part of what you're talking about. And so, in talking about the machinery of slavery, you're talking about it's people like Ridgway who preserve the system and make money preserving the system. His father, a blacksmith, who, once the cotton boom starts taking off and towns start sprouting up, blacksmiths become important because they're making the nails for the houses, the steel rims for the wheels that take the cotton to market. And so everyone is just sort of enmeshed in slavery, whether you are on a plantation or not, whether you get the direct benefits or not. Everyone is sort of serving to prop up the system. And so I think George Carlin's in there, and Frantz Fanon, I think, so all those people who sort of subliminally changed my point of view when I was very impressionable are sort of in the book in different ways.
Yeah. No. Yeah.
You've made multiple references to your inspiration, to what you've drawn upon American history, even referenced family history. Is there a character that is autobiographical, or did you insert yourself into the book in some manner?
Oh, I think I'm in some books more than others. I think I'm not so much in this book, really, in a weird way. And in terms of historical characters, no one's really based on anybody. I mean, I think that's the last section I read is drawing from Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, but everything they were describing in their debates in the late 19th century are echoed in contemporary debates about wither the black community. So Mingo on the plantation on Valentine Farm is like, can we save these people who've been damaged too much by slavery? And then you have conservative voices nowadays who are like, people who've been ruined by the inner cities and drugs, can we take them along with us? Why don't they pull their pants up? The sort of respectability politics have an echo of some conservative rhetoric in the 19th century. So I'm usually more in my books. I think maybe the book turned out good because I'm not in there. I'm not sure.
I just want to take different people. Anybody else? Yeah, right there.
I just wanted to say a testimony to the magic of your realism. I can't remember how far into the book I asked myself the question, wait a minute, is there really tunnels with trains down there?
Yeah, I mean, I bet people were like, I thought it actually was a real railroad until I started reading reviews of your book, and they're like, no, it's not that way, and so I think it's a failure of our educational system that people actually do believe that there is. I actually got into a fight with someone in England who I guess had found something on the website and was like, no, but the railroad was real. It's like, no, it's not. Please, I just wrote a book about it. Like, it is not real. Like, I've seen pictures. Like, maybe you saw a picture of like a hole, but it was not a train. Trust me.
Right, yeah.
You've spoken about your process in this book, and you in terms of pages a lot. Like, I gave this person this number of pages and 60 pages in each place, and I was hoping maybe you could kind of speak about how you came across those rules and to what extent you found yourself chafing against them or bringing yourself up because of the rules of your project.
Sure. I mean, I think I really like structure, so I have the structure before I start. I have to know the beginning and the end before I start, or else I don't know. I have to know the destination before I start writing, and I'm hopefully from the first page writing to the destination. But of course, as characters become more or less important, as the story changes, you have to allow for that things to change. But I have to know like the basics before I start. And I guess in my dumb way, it seems like it's hard enough to find the right words each day. If I actually don't know what's going to happen each day, introduce the sheriff, describe the sheriff's office, or whatever. It seems twice as hard. So each day I have like a task. And then it seemed I was writing the biographical sections, and the first one was Ajari, the grandmother, and it seemed like 6 pages was a good sort of length for them. But then in my middle age, I'm like, you can't just like stick to your dumb systems, Colson. And so even though Ridgeway was the second one, and all the other ones are 5 to 6 pages, and each 10 pages, I was like, just let it go. I was like, relax, take a deep breath. You can have a 10-page chapter. And so, I'm constantly, fighting between an urge for order and symmetry and stuff like that, and also just allowing myself not to be so ruled by that. And I think this book, it served this book well.
Let me just ask, how many people here want to get a book signed? Okay. Join me in thanking Colson Whitehead for this
Thank
evening.
you, guys.